Okay. What did we do with our lives before Zoom? I mean, seriously. All right. It looks like everything is streaming okay, so we can get started. Hello, everyone. It is the end of March, and it is the weekend before WrestleMania. Am I correct on this one? Okay. It's a very apt time to have this conversation. So, welcome to the Popular Culture Dialogues. Today's conversation is on the current state of professional wrestling, and there's a lot to talk about. So, we're going to dive into it with some of our pop culture experts here and professional wrestling experts. So, I'm going to throw it to each of you to introduce yourselves and what brings you here today. And I'm going to start over to what I see as my left, someone who's, I'm going to guess, near to where the NXT and AEW folks may be. But Matthew, what brings you to us today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. NXT is only like 3 hours away from me, so I'm always like, do I go see them today? Like, but that parking lot is way too scary, to be in. So I'm coming from Florida Atlantic University. I'm Dr. Matthew Elfenbein. Um, I've been watching wrestling my entire life, and when I came to my dissertation, I was kind of at a crossroads because I talk about choreographed bodies, and how they like how we perceive emotion on them. I ended up going the Disney route with it, but I was very close to doing because I do on animation and dancing
Mm-hmm.
in that. But wrestling is very close to that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I take, I'm coming at it from, but I'm coming at it from so many different ways because it's not just the choreography of the wrestling bodies,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but now more so now it's even the choreography behind the behind the scenes, right? Of the
Mm-hmm.
cameras, of all the people running around. So I'm excited to talk, excited to. Oh, it's exciting. It's an exciting season right now.
It really is. All right. Thank you, Matthew, for being here. And then I'm going to go over to my right to Jessica.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here. So I'm Jessica Fontaine. I just completed my PhD in communication studies. It's an option in gender studies at McGill University. And my dissertation focused on professional wrestling. So in it, I have a look at the professional wrestling industry really from 2016 to kind of about a year ago because I had to finish
Mhm.
writing. Um, and I read across the indies and all elite wrestling over most kind of where I focused, and I'm really looking at it through kind of three lenses that I think kind of intersect in the ways that professional wrestling operates as a performance genre and an industry,
Mhm.
which are labor, so the processes of work, both
Mhm.
in the ring, including care work and performance work, and then also the kind of work that happens outside of it on social media, selling merch, all of those types of things. Um, and then affect, so emotions, feelings,
Mhm.
atmospheres, all of those types of things. Because I always think about the ways we're always looking to get to that pop, right, in professional wrestling. And then kayfabe, so which is the way I talk about there is as the kind of feelings of realness in professional
Mhm.
wrestling. So that's where I come to it. I didn't watch wrestling growing up. Though I'm from Winnipeg, so it was all around me at that time. So I have memories of vaguely seeing it around me, but really started watching around 2016. Came in through Kenny Omega and the Golden Lovers, and then also watching Dean Ambrose lose the Royal Rumble and being angry about it and not really knowing why. So that's how I come to professional wrestling in this conversation today.
Wonderful. And I love that idea of the feelings of reality. We might have to talk
Mm.
more about that
Hmm.
for something I'm working on. Great.
Oh,
Thank you,
great.
Jessica. And I'm going to go down to my lower left. We're going to go to Aaron.
Hello, Aaron Horton, Dr. Aaron Horton, professor of history at Alabama State University. Um, I, like Matthew, am a lifelong wrestling fan. I remember watching the Hulk Hogan Andre the Giant primetime match in 1988 when I was elementary school age. So with the twin referees and all that. So I mean, that's how long I've been following wrestling. I am a traditionally trained historian in modern German and Japanese history and culture. So I sort of have gravitated into writing more about pop culture and the sort of intertwinings of
Mhm.
identity and popular culture. So I've written pieces about like gender identity and heavy metal music in Germany and Japan, for example. I've written about soccer, but also I've indulged my lifelong love of professional wrestling and done some work on that. German and Japanese stereotypes in professional wrestling. Uh, I have an upcoming piece about the creation of or the conceptualization and the realization of the statue of the famous the Crusher from AWA territory in South Milwaukee. It was a GoFundMe project that got a statue of him built. So I'm actually have a chapter in an edited volume coming out about the process by which that was created. So yeah, always happy to talk about professional wrestling with fellow fans, especially in this sort of setting. So I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thanks, Aaron. And then we're going to go down to my lower right to Lee.
Hi, everyone. Lee Benica. I am the non-academic representative for the Professional Wrestling Studies Association, so I won't tell you about all the great articles that I've written about pro wrestling because I haven't. But my interest goes back again to my childhood too, and I'm a bit older maybe, so this would be the mid to late 70s in Kansas, so the Central States
Mhm.
promotion, which was not amazingly, hasn't held up as a critical darling over the years, very low rent, but it was engaging somehow to me. In college, I majored in religion and a little bit of anthropology and did a major senior paper on ritual and religious imagery in professional wrestling and received a postgraduate fellowship to interview people in the professional wrestling business during 1991 and 1992. Jessica's been very kind to post my old interviews on the website for the Professional Wrestling Studies Association, so that's much appreciated. It's these days my interest mostly is in professional wrestling criticism, so the how that's done, how it's analyzed by fans and professionals alike. So I think that's most of me. Thanks.
Thanks. And that issue about criticism, that's kind of a big thing right now, too, with all the different ways that I see wrestlers, fans, and critics kind of fighting one another on social media. So I'm just going to start the conversation with what the heck is going on in professional wrestling these days? What are some things you're seeing that are maybe new, maybe they're different from the past, or are we seeing, kind of just the same things from the past, but they're just repackaged differently these days? What do you see going on? Go ahead, Matthew.
You know, last night I watched Paradise Alley, Sylvester Stallone. Right. So I got to watch Terry Funk wrestle in water, which was a lot of fun. But the one thing that I got from that, and then also watching Raw like this past Monday night,
Mhm.
um, is really an emphasis on bodies, right?
Mhm.
Just kind of like again these hardened male bodies that Tasker writes about. I don't know, many years ago, not many years ago, but somewhat. Um, but we're kind of getting back to that where, The Rock could stand in the ring for like 5 minutes, do absolutely nothing. And yet we're all just infatuated and excited and everyone's screaming and yelling.
Mhm.
All based on, not even like real wrestling movements, but just
Mhm.
standing there and being. Um, so it's almost like getting back to the statuesque spectacle, um,
Mhm.
because and then hopefully when they actually come head to head, which we kind of saw, but at WrestleMania, the spectacle will explode, right? And become something beyond just this anticipation that's building and building. Yeah, it's exciting. Like I said, really exciting. And it's good to be, and it's funny we all said like, we're fans because we are fans. And like WWE has recently started going back to using the word fans, but for a while we were referred to as like the universe. So I always think like, yes, I the universe. So yeah.
So maybe The Rock shouldn't be called The Rock anymore, just the statue. Something to throw out there, Dwayne, if you're looking for a new moniker at all. Aaron, what do you think about what's going on in wrestling right now?
I think it's fascinating that wrestling has probably never been more profitable in terms of these massive TV deals, massive streaming deals like the WWE deal with Netflix. Like, I've done a lot of research and reading about the early history of pro wrestling, and some of the promoters from the territorial days would have they couldn't have conceived of this, even accounting for inflation, of wrestling generating this kind of revenue. And it's because the fundamental model has changed. The model used to be use TV to get people to come to the arenas, and then use TV to get people to buy pay-per-views. Now, the main revenue streams are different. And at the worst of times in modern times, that means that, which I think happened certainly with WWE before Vince left, I think there tended to be a stagnation creatively because you just need to put the content out there and worry less about what is necessarily resonating with fans in a way that will translate to them watching or attending, because you have that steady revenue stream from the TV deals. But thankfully, I think creatively things have turned around a bit, as Matthew mentioned, and I think people are, and that's reflected in ticket sales and other metrics. But I'm fascinated by that because I think if you were to add up all of the regular fans attending the territories pre 1984 or something, attending matches around the country on a regular basis, there are probably less people watching wrestling now, or it's less pervasive in the cultural zeitgeist than it has been in the past, and yet it's never been more profitable. And I think that's an interesting. Wrestling's in an interesting place now because of that. Because the average person, at least people I talk to, they may not know who Roman Reigns is. Wrestling fans know who Roman Reigns is, right? They might know who John Cena is, but they definitely know who The Rock and Steve Austin are, or Hulk Hogan, right? Before that, they know. So it seems like it's like current stars are less in the cultural zeitgeist than has been the case in the past. And I think that maybe is a sign that it isn't as, it's a little more niche than it used to be, and yet it's more profitable than it's ever been before. So I was reflecting on that this morning as I was thinking about this. It's fascinating.
And I think maybe one thing to think about too is that it's gone from the local to the national, and now it's global. But as it's been moving up, it's kind of been spreading thinner and getting nicher at the same time. I don't know, maybe that's some way to think about the trajectory as well.
And I think that's true. I think that's true of entertainment in general, because when wrestling exploded on the national stage in the 50s, in the early television era, there were 4 channels. Yeah. So your audience has limited choices of what to watch. Now we have just almost an infinite array of things to choose from. So people are going to tend to gravitate more toward things that very specifically suit their pre-existing interests. And it's less likely they're going to just flip through a limited number of channels and say, oh, this looks interesting, and then become a fan in the way they might have done in the 50s or 60s or 70s when you had fewer options.
And to that also, like the the access to some channels that have wrestling on it, like MLW for a while, you could really only get like with DirecTV.
Yeah.
And then there was a time that like you couldn't get it, so you had to go to YouTube. Same with like WoW, Women of Wrestling. If you don't like have these satellite channels, which increasingly people aren't because they're moving away, right? And so
Yeah.
that's a very interesting, like this globalization of and a proliferation of wrestling, but at the same time, it's like maybe so much without so much access. Yeah.
Yeah, too much competition, too many voices, hard to find anything to take hold.
Yeah.
Lee, what do you think about what's going on in wrestling these days?
Yeah, I guess one thing that occurs to me is because of the access to information, the access to um, you know, all the content. As Matthew said, sometimes it kind of is hit and miss whether you can access things, but overall, we're definitely not in the days of tape trading through the mail, of getting VHS tapes in the mail, which I wasn't quite in that scene, but I was in the DVD scene of getting comp DVDs from collectors who would put things from Japan and Mexico and Joshi and all sorts of things. It was really my only exposure to that back in the early 2000s or late 1990s. So it's great to have all that information out there and all these extra insights into what's going on, but I think it takes away a bit of the sense of wonder. I remember when I was, years ago watching and Dusty Rhodes appeared in the World Wrestling Federation. That kind of blew my mind. Like, what is he doing here? I can't believe they got him. The WWF is so dominant. If they took that star from the NWA or WCW, and then when Ric Flair appeared with his digitized world's title, also like maybe you saw that coming a little more if you were kind of in the know or following things a bit. But still, it was shocking. And there's stars moving from one company to another now, but you kind of know that's happening in advance, months and months. So it builds some anticipation when it finally happens. That is exciting, but the sense of wonder isn't quite there. I think that there used to be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned people coming because I know like we all knew Mercedes Moné was going to show up in AEW, and then all the hints kept being there. Although I was holding out hope that Wendy Richter was going to show up just for the payoff, because I think that would have been funny. But it is interesting the ways in which promoters are interacting with critics and with the news and everything in order to try to control those narratives and to create surprises or to manage anticipation and things like that too. Because I mean, the way that the AEW handled Mercedes Moné is different than the way that WWE handled CM Punk coming back. So it is kind of interesting in that regard. Jessica, what do you think about what's going on right now?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's interesting about professional wrestling is the way it's always operating as a liminal genre that's always going on, right? So it's always pulling on different genres. We can think about kind of these move towards engaging with reality television to now kind of happening also with on social media, as you pointed out. But I also think about it as being liminal as always also kind of being in transition. And I feel like so and I think about that, yeah, if we're thinking about it as a kind of part of a media landscape, right? So moving from being solely live to moving to television, broadcast to like cable and pay-per-view, and now we have this kind of move to streaming. And so it's always kind of engaged with what's ever going on within the kind of media industries more broadly. I think the move to like WWE moving to Netflix is really interesting um, because we can think of it as part of being this kind of move towards liveness that streaming platforms are moving towards to try to get more revenue. They're going to put commercials possibly into it, right? Or advertise, within the broadcast itself, like we see with energy drinks everywhere right now. So we have that, but the other side of that is I think it's going to be interesting to see how the wrestling culture and like critics online also respond to this, because Netflix is really private about it's streaming, about how much things are being
Mhm.
watched. And so, we're not going to be able to go to the arguments around how many people were watching last night to show whether something was good or not. Like, what's going to happen with these kind of narratives that particularly get used to pin up, WWE against AEW, that fans and journalist dirt sheets use. So I think that's something that's really going to be interesting to see. That's kind of like, is going to start soon. So in ways it's kind of like, we're already kind of transitioning towards it. And so that's one thing that I've been thinking about, is what's going to happen with this kind of move to the streamers. And then does AEW also move to a more streaming
Yeah.
platform as well? And then how do the wars play out on social media around that? How do the critiques play out? But yeah, so that's one thing that kind of comes to mind as I was listening to our conversation kind of start here.
Well, and it's also, is this going to be, the future of television too? Because I think, Aaron, you were talking about how professional wrestling has been a part of television since the 1950s, and that's kind of when media historians will say, well, that's when television really takes off. That's when you really start to see it become the cultural zeitgeist that it is. And so professional wrestling in some form, whether it is on a local television network or a more national network, has been a part of American television history since the beginning of television. And part of this moving to streaming, and especially like with WWE being on Peacock for, was it 2 years now? And before that, it was the WWE network. It's kind of been keeping in pace with how we've been seeing television changing too. So it would be interesting to see if this next step, how this has a bigger impact for television. One thing I want to ask all of you then is, because you have been watching wrestling, or at least several of you for a longer time. And I know, Jessica, I think you and I are more newer converts to this entire fandom. Do you think it's better now? Or are there aspects of professional wrestling that's better now? Are there aspects that are worse? I mean, what do you think about that as a fan first, and then maybe a scholar second?
I think visibility with social media, right? So you get a lot more wrestlers putting their name out there, building up their fan base. Though at the same time with that, I feel that a lot of the wrestling that we see on TV, or even in, like on the premium live events or pay-per-views, whatever you want to call it, is also being set towards social media at times, right? Like some of the big pops, the way they frame certain things is to fit that very vertical TikTok frame, or right. It's exciting. I think people could argue that it's becoming almost less wrestling. There's like, I mean, like for Monday Night Raw, most of it was, it was like that South Park episode. Me and my dad were watching it. We were laughing because it was like, we need our opera glasses, for most of it. But then the wrestling, I think also with so much competition is almost getting better for the consumer, because they're putting on matches that are with very talented people who don't necessarily have to win, right? Like Ricochet and JD McDonough, two commercials, three segments of of the show tore down the house, but they're not bringing in tickets, but they are going to bring in social media viewers. So I wonder, along with like the whole business model that Aaron was talking about and Jessica was mentioning, and Lee also brought up, right? We all did. Right? That's what we're talking about. So how that like shift in social media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So I'm always amazed watching AEW, just how quickly they get clips out or pictures out on Twitter. So it is almost like maybe they have it planned ahead of time, that they know that something cool is going to happen at this particular point. So let's get ready to grab it and put it out on the feed. Interesting. Other thoughts about are things better these these days in professional wrestling?
Well, yeah, I have some thoughts. I think that, firstly, I think that in the United States, the treatment of women's wrestling has never been better. Because if you lived through the Attitude Era, or even the early 2000s and this, this diva stuff, or even if you go back to the 80s, where you might get a women's match with Fabulous Moolah or one of the girls she trained, the women she trained, Moolah's girls. She had like an iron grip on that, of course, but it in terms of being treated seriously, in terms of being presented as something that is serious, it's not a sideshow, it's not a bathroom break match, which is how fans treated those matches back then. It's how promoters treated those matches, as just sort of a sideshow thing. Now, Japan has its own history of sort of completely separate women's wrestling, and I'm a big fan of Joshi wrestling, and I think they're still way beyond in terms of the way the women are trained, which is extremely rigorous, and the in-ring work is generally better in Japan. But in the States, I don't think it's ever been better than it is right now. So I think that's a wonderful development, and I'm glad that WWE finally got on board with that, because you had indie promotions trying to do that, like Shimmer, right, and groups like that. But I think that's great, and long overdue. Although I think still, I think that more could be done in terms of giving women more time, because oftentimes if you look at a 2-hour show, you might get one women's match, maybe two. So I think there's still more that can be done, but definitely it's never been better. So that's certainly something that I think is a positive improvement. I think that the current in-ring product, in terms of just any given episode of Raw or SmackDown or Dynamite or Collision or any given pay-per-view or premium live event, I think in terms of the in-ring work rate, as the smart fans say, I think wrestling's never been better in those terms either. I think if you compare just the skill, the athletic ability that we're seeing now consistently across the board, it's probably never been better. Having said that, going back to, I guess, my earlier comments, I think that something has been lost in the smartification of wrestling fandom, right? Right, because Lee talked about it. There was a sense of wonder when you were younger, when you didn't know the backstage maneuverings. Ric Flair just shows up on in 1991 in the WWF, and you don't know about his contract negotiations and all of that falling through with Jim Herd. You didn't know that. It was those moments felt more real and more organic, even though now we know the stories behind those. And I think I'm of two minds about this. I think that fans were more invested in who won and lost back then. And I think that if you watch crowd reactions in the old days, fans, they're more fanatical. I mean, we've all heard the stories about the old ladies trying to stab wrestlers back in the day. Like, that was a real thing that happened, right? And people trying to, and maybe it's good that that's not happening so much anymore, but it did indicate that people were as passionate about that as they are about their football team or their local sports team, whatever. But and I've thought about this a lot. Wrestling fans, most wrestling fans, I truly believe, since the late 1800s, most wrestling fans have known on some level that what they're watching is not 100% legitimate. I did a piece a couple of years ago for the Journal of History of Ideas blog about that. Just, there were newspaper articles in the 1890s saying that wrestling's fake. Like, these guys are out there just putting on a show. They're phonies. And I think that throughout the history of wrestling, you find people sort of mocking it and saying this is phony baloney, this is nonsense. And I think a lot of fans knew that on some level. They didn't know the inner workings the way we have since the 80s, and especially getting into the internet era. But they knew they were watching something and enjoying something that was part performance. And I think that's been true throughout the history of wrestling. So I'm kind of two minds of that on that. I think some of that fanatical passion has been lost, although I think fans are very invested in what happens with Cody Rhodes and Roman Reigns next Sunday, for sure. But sometimes that intense fan fanaticism is not present in the way it would have been in Mid-Atlantic wrestling in the early 80s or in other territories in the 70s and such. So I guess my thoughts on that.
Okay. Lee or Jessica, do you want to bounce off of that? Or share your thoughts on if you think it's any better today?
You want to go first, Jessica?
You go ahead. You have a longer history with it than me, so I mean, I can speak to kind of what I think maybe is more recent. But you go ahead first.
Okay, I'll say something. It's kind of recent too. I agree with everything that's been said so far, but this is probably a very broad generalization. But based on my understanding, and there's some very important caveats to this, I think the business overall is more healthy for the participants in that the schedule is not as rough, where you're doing a show in one city, then driving 10 hours to another city, and you're having to work while you're injured, or else you might lose your spot. So, taking the uppers and the downers and the pain pills. I mean, it seems like now folks are stars are taking a lot of time off. They just kind of disappear for months and months, and then they'll come back. And there's not as many shows. I think companies management is more sympathetic to hopefully the physical and mental health needs of the wrestlers. The caveats, of course, are the cultural sexual abuse in the world of wrestling entertainment that's still coming to light, which is horrifying, and it's long lasting. And then just the style, the physical style that was brought up, I think, by Aaron about the work rate or whatever. It's great. It's amazing to watch, but it also can set the stage for some serious injuries because the very risky moves, and if they're not done perfectly well, then you can get injured. So maybe the injuries are greater, but the athletes are getting more time to recover, which is a good thing. So just comparing what's happening today to watch Dark Side of the Ring, and guilty pleasure, but there's some really sad stories about how people just got chewed up and spit up by the industry over the years. So I think that's a good thing. I don't know if you're going to ask about things that are worse, but I can hold off.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely get to that one next. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, I still believe that Darby Allin just wants to die in the ring. So my partner Chris keeps saying when we watch some of these people and the things they're doing, they're not going to be able to walk when they're in their 40s. So I do hope that younger kids will be listening to the older folks to understand about all of that as well. And Jessica, from the more recent perspective, do you think it's been getting better just in the time that you've been watching?
Yeah, I don't know if I really fully think in terms of better or worse. I really appreciate what's been said, particularly about thinking about kind of these intersections of the performance and the labor. So like these kind of questions around health. I mean, and safety, and the violence that has been sexual violence and social violence that's been experienced backstage, and we know continues to happen. So I mean, I think in some ways, we still have some of the kind of like, we know this is still happening and it's not really being reckoned with. I mean, if we think about so I did a bunch of interviews for my dissertation with people working on the indie scene, and it was happening in the middle of COVID. So it was an interesting context to have this because there was kind of a pause. And so there was this question of, in regards to the speaking out movement in professional wrestling, what will happen after? And as far as we can really see, I don't see any real structures that have been put in place on either indie levels. I see I've taught, particular promotions that kind of seem to try to put a system in place, but we don't know of anything happening on the kind of, major level of like, we have put this system in place to try to prevent this type of thing from continuing to happen. So there's kind of that side of it. And I think there's also, it's been pointed out that women's wrestling is definitely better, but still has such a long way to go. I mean, even just the fact that they did one women's pay-per-view and that was it, like it feels very much like a PR grab in that sense, right? And especially because it did so well, and yet there's never been one again. And I think also just thinking around like LGBTQ plus wrestlers as well. So we have, some representation as well, but not where it needs to be for there to really be, in my mind, like real change. And I think I like what was talking about too around this kind of question around this kind of the excitement or the kind of magic or wonder of professional wrestling. Yeah, and I think we see glimmers of it around, not even glimmers. Like I think it's real around Cody right now and the way that people are kind of waiting to see what happens. And I think we have like Kofi's run was one that had tons of engagement in it, and Daniel Bryan's before that, right? So we have these times where it happens, and to me it seems like in some ways that's a storytelling issue, right? When it doesn't happen. And that storytelling doesn't have to be just on the ring, because excitement around, say, the construction of AEW or construction of All In, which, Carrie Lynn, you've written about around like how they used BTE to do that type of stuff. We see the ways in which the excitement can build in that kind of like, ooh, what's going to happen next, even while having all these kind of backstage knowledge can happen. So there's something about, investment and storytelling that like needs to come together to create that kind of magic, I think. I don't have an answer for what that is, but that's kind of what I see.
And I just want to piggyback off of that, because I do think this idea of the emotional aspect is really important here. And I think there's still those stereotypes about masculinity that are fully preventing this exploration of how to develop the emotional aspect of storytelling, because it is so important for those feelings of reality. I wrote it down, the affect of authenticity and these types of things that I think, Jessica, that you're writing about, because it is important to create the buy-in, to have people be able to still mark out, even if they are smart about the wrestling as well. And so that has to be explored further too. I also part of me hopes that moving more towards streaming might also mean we could get intergender wrestling going too, because I think to really get at those stereotypes, we're going to have to fully address that and demonstrate that, it can be anyone can win, and it doesn't have to be you can only have men on men and women on women or things like that. Just blow apart this binary completely. But then we do have other issues like the ongoing issues regarding sexual abuse or sexual harassment. And I know with AEW, I don't know if any of you noticed this when Mercedes Moné debuted in Boston. It was on hard cam. Someone had a sign that was asking, well, where is Sammy Guevara? Because Sammy had been placed on suspension previously with this idea that it was because he gave Jeff Hardy a concussion, which sure, okay. But there's that story that goes back to the early days in AEW of the kind of icky stuff that Sammy Guevara was doing towards Sasha Banks at the time and all these things. And I have a feeling that part of Mercedes coming in is requiring Sammy to not be there. So there's all of this that still has to be fully explored and talked about, and not just kind of like pushed off into a kayfabe storytelling. Which then, of course, as Lee wanted to know, what are the darker parts right now? What might not be going so well right now in professional wrestling?
Do you mind if
As
I go first? Because
go for it.
I've got to jump off in about 5 minutes for another
Sure.
meeting. I'm at work, sadly. But yeah, I'm kind of picking up on a theme that's come up several times about the passion, the believability now versus then. And yeah, I think the believability is a factor that I kind of miss these days. I think what's happening is believed and embraced by the audience to an extent today, but nothing like in the 70s or even 80s when people like literally believed what was going on and would get really worked up about it. And watching old footage of matches from the early 80s in various territories, always amazed by the audience participation, i.e., people trying to get into the ring to stop things from happening. That's not a good thing at all. Usually the audience members get the worst of it because even the referees seem to know how to handle those situations pretty brutally and effectively. But it seems like the audiences today that I see on TV, and this is just AEW because that's all I watch. It's a lot of signs with really irrelevant words on them that seem to be promoting the fans and trying to get the individual fans over or their own projects or whatever over, and it makes no sense. And it's just really, it can be distracting to what's going on. And then the chants, which are great, it's audience participation, but again, it seems kind of formulaic and rote sometimes, and just kind of gets away from the personal, like real passionate reaction that you used to see more often in the old days. Thanks.
It's kind of like there's this expectation that if you're going to go to a live show, you kind of want to go to be able to participate in specific types of chants or dances and things like that too, which is almost the same as you want to see specific spots. So the expectations of what the fan experience is perhaps have changed then too. And thank you, Lee. If you have to pop off, totally.
Yeah.
Don't
Thanks.
worry
I
about
really enjoyed it. Hopefully you can do it again. Thanks so much.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I to go off of that the chants? I was on Raw and SmackDown, and hopefully they don't do this on Netflix. But every week it always becomes this moment. I call it like the religious moment when they have to bleep out, it's holy, right? And it's so all you hear is just them saying holy, and it does detract from the entire experience. So I appreciate you mentioning that because it's always a fun religious moment.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So wait. So because I haven't watched Raw and SmackDown in years, they actually bleep out fan swearing as well.
It's pretty loud. So yeah, because the whole crowd will start chanting holy, right? And so yeah, they do that part.
Wow,
But they
I
keep
appreciate that. Because if I was watching with a like 4-year-old or what, maybe not 4-year-old, but whatever, a young person, some of the shut the blank up over and over again. I mean, it's very audible. And maybe bleeping it out makes it even more dramatic. It's like putting the little red pixelation over someone's head when they're getting stabbed with a fork by Abdullah the Butcher. It's like it's even more horrifying because you can't see it.
Yeah.
No, I also just find that interesting because we watch AEW on TNT and TBS, and they will, if they catch it, they will bleep out when the wrestlers do it, but they just let the fans. They don't try to silence the fans chanting like that, which interesting. Don't know what to make of that one yet, but okay.
Yeah.
Other thoughts of what's going on and what's not so good right now. Oh, there goes Lee.
I'm sorry. Did you ask me to weigh in? Is that did I hear you correctly? Oh, okay. I am and I myself, I mostly watch AEW and Stardom in Japan, which is the top women's promotion in Japan, New Japan, a lot of Japanese stuff. But I usually watch the big WWE shows. I don't watch week to week, but I watch most of the big shows, Rumble, WrestleMania, that sort of thing. But one of the things that bothers me the most right now is just and I see this in social media, the absolutely ridiculous tribalism among wrestling fans, which I think is a sad reflection of just our society in general. Like you see it certainly in politics, right? And I think it's just a reflection of where we are in society that it's descended into that tribalism. But to me, it's very frustrating because essentially, in some of the fan groups I follow on Facebook, for example, like basically you have a group of fans that think that anything that finds something wrong with anything AEW does, WWE, pro WWE crowd. Then you have AEW fans who criticize every single thing that WWE does.
Mm-hmm.
It's frustrating because, as we've discussed, it's never been easier to watch good wrestling than it is now. Because I think Lee earlier mentioned the tape trading. I did that back in the 90s. Like, I started watching Japanese wrestling in the 90s, and the only way to do it was you had to get these tape trading connections and get all these VHS tapes. I still have them somewhere, tons of them, even though I don't have a VHS player. But it's never been easier to watch whatever type of wrestling you want to watch. Basically, every promotion, even indie promotions, have streaming. So whatever your preference, whatever style you like, you can find it. But then there's this dark side of people feeling this need to, I guess, validate whatever their preferences are by constantly attacking and putting down other fans, other promotions, instead of just saying, as I do, right? Like, most of the time, Raw and SmackDown, not really my thing. Just, again, I watch the big shows. It's just not for me, right? I prefer my wrestling be a little presented a bit differently. Instead, people have to go out of their way to launch these attacks and to constantly put down the other, whoever likes something different than you do, right? Whoever has different preferences, you have to put them down. And again, I think it's a sad reflection of just where we are as a society in modern times. I don't think that it's definitely not specific to wrestling fans, because you see it in other fan cultures. Fans of, sci-fi properties and comic books or whatever. That's just, people are constantly at odds with each other. Instead of saying, hey, we both like this thing, let's agree on that. No, if you don't like exactly the specific thing that I like in the way that I like it, then I have to put you down. And I think that's an ugly side to fan culture in general right now. And certainly it frustrates me among wrestling fans.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's written about this, I'm going to just completely 100% agree with you on that. But yeah, it always is fascinating to me. Even if you're like a WWE fan, sometimes it can also become down to, are you a Roman Reigns fan or not a Roman Reigns fan? Or are you a Cena fan or not a Cena fan? Those types of things too. And that rivalry and the need to identify yourself in opposition and kind of like this dialectic opposition with someone else is just an interesting part of humanity that, yes, it makes us interesting, but it could potentially just, undercut humanity in the long run, which sounds like a very dark place. And I don't want to go down that road right now. So I'm just going to go over to Jessica and say, Jessica, what do you think about, what is not so good about what's going on right now?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it's interesting how a lot of what we're talking about here is kind of this relationship between fans, and then relationships between the audience and the promotions. And that's kind of what I've been thinking about too, is this kind of and I agree with what's been said, is the relationship between the promotions and the fans. And then kind of going back to what we've already been talking about, is I still think about the ways in which women have been pushed out of professional wrestling. So, I mean, we've talked about the old ladies that were, stabbing people in the crowd, but like women were a huge group of fans within the 1950s. And some of the research shows that they were actually prioritized in the ways that the commentators were talking about, kind of like the more feminized qualities of professional wrestling, including like the costumes, right? The gear, the robes, the like the fabrics that were being chosen, like, you know, and this is black and white, so they're telling you the colors and all these things. They're creating kind of a more feminized world within that context. And then we see like, and then if you know, you go back and you watch like the crowds from the early 80s and into the, you know, 90s, and you see a more gender diverse crowd, you hear a more gender diverse crowd as well. And then like, you know, the pushed out in the Attitude Era when it prioritizes, you know, white young men, basically. And I think we're still in the aftermath of that, where there has been more of a, you know, a welcome to marginalized fans, but in the ways that, you know, as you were saying earlier about the ways in which, you know, this kind of hyper masculinity is still kind of the standard in professional wrestling, and the narratives that get told around that still have this kind of you know, kind of barrier, or not, you know, that there's still particular stories that get told and prioritized, and there's room for other stories being told and other stories to be prioritized, which would, you know, if you want to, professional wrestling is a capitalist industry. It loves money. Just try to take more people's money by inviting them in, right? Like, if that's your goal. Anyway, so that's my little rant of what the thing that I just don't get it. Yeah.
But it's interesting because thinking about this idea of like a turn in audience, it almost seems to correlate with the rise of McMahon and the power that he started asserting. The idea that McMahon was always about, you know, the big bodied men, and things like that. And I mean, definitely during the Attitude Era and then the Diva Era, I think as the allegations are coming to light, the whole framing of women is pretty much a reflection of him, to the fact that like Larry Woodall has been talking about Vince McMahon as an auteur and things like that too, which I think are important considerations. So with him being removed now from professional wrestling, possibly forever. I mean, he was removed once and he did come back, but this one might stick this time. Do you see professional wrestling changing in the near future? Like, I'm not going to ask like, you know, 20 years out, but like within the next 5 years, what do you think is going to be happening in professional wrestling? Are there going to be certain things that you think are going to be more likely to happen than not? I'm just going to keep talking for a little bit and give you some time to think. Do you think that there are any changes that we are going to see in professional wrestling moving forward in this era where essentially, well, there are no McMahons in control?
So I don't think in the immediate future. I mean, I've probably in the 5-10 years down the line, because I think, you know, being like it is, like you said, like Jessica said, it's a capitalist thing. They're in for the money, and so things are planned, right? There's a pipeline of people, of new wrestlers coming in, you know, storylines happening, that I don't think they're just gonna like wash their hands of and step away from right now. I think that wouldn't really make much sense. Especially with so much competition, right? Like if they really started shaking things up, and I think we saw that with the shakeup kind of unsettles things a bit with when The Rock said he's going to wrestle Roman Reigns at WrestleMania, and then immediately the crowd, you know, pushed back, and now we have this whole like double match Cody inserted thing. You know, and then turning The Rock heel. So I don't know about the immediate future. Though one thing I would say, production wise, with the like the old guard leaving and this new guard with the new technology that's being used, the visual style is kind of like I if you in watching Raw, it's almost moving back to that Attitude Era kind of style that focuses on the audience, on the fans, lighting them again. Because there's been a while that it's just been like very focused on the ring and the action within. Now it's going back to this time that, let's light everyone, let's bring some signs back. Though I do agree the signs are also distracting because right there it's you get someone's QR code or something like that, and it throws it off. So I think again more of a focus on the crowd. They do this also on NXT, right? Like with NXT 2.0 and then kind of reverting back to I guess 3.0, whatever NXT is now. But again, still focusing on the crowd, really, widening the scope, and the new technology of visualizing wrestling, just incredible.
That's interesting about the crowd too, because I've noticed AEW has done that for a while, and it always makes me feel like they're trying to replicate what it's like to be at a smaller indie relationship between the wrestling and the crowd. So it's interesting to hear WWE might be going back to that. Okay. Aaron or Jessica?
I just want to pop on that, so thinking about lighting the crowd is really interesting. Because it goes back to an early time. And it's interesting if we think that they've been selling out arenas a lot right now. So it's also like showing this huge filled up place, right? And really like attesting to like, you should be here. This is exciting. Like, look how big this is. Like, it kind of adds to that, like, right? Because that's what the crowd does. The crowd brings that feeling to it. So it's interesting to think that they're kind of using that as well as to kind of generate that atmosphere on the screen. The question of whether it'll change, I think McMahon's effect is really big in establishing the current kind of genre of professional wrestling and what it looks like and what it does. And I think until there gets a broader view of who is imagined as best for business, what types of stories are imagined as best for business, I think we're on a long road to that changing. I think that scope can broaden, but I think there's been so much, and you hear it in the narratives that wrestlers tell on podcasts of when they talk about, what makes a good wrestler. A lot of that is really ingrained, and so I think there's a lot of cultural work that'll have to change before we see any vast changes.
Interesting. Okay. And Aaron?
I think this pertains more to WWE than AEW. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, I have preferred AEW since its founding, but I think we're seeing in WWE a move away from the more scripted, very oftentimes stale or flat presentations. Like all the promos sounded the same there for a while when Vince was in charge. Like you could tell they were written by the same people, and in that environment, and in an environment where Vince, at least from my perspective, did not listen to fans, like people would get over and they would get buried. And these are potential top stars. I don't see it. They don't have the right look, and they would get buried. It happened with Zack Ryder, right? It happened with Bray Wyatt for a while, or early on. He was getting over. WrestleMania 30, I was there live in New Orleans. He loses to John Cena. I was just kind of baffled because he got one of the biggest reactions of anyone that night. And Vince had this way of just doing what he thought was right because he beat Ted Turner, he beat all the territorial promotions. So how could he be wrong, right? I think he got to the point where he knew better than the fans. And I'm beginning to see it feels like the Triple H regime, I guess, creative regime is more responsive to the fans. And I think that Cody's rise as a top babyface is it feels organic, and I suspect that many of his promos, at least partly, are off the cuff in the style of the old days when people were allowed to develop their characters and either get over or sometimes not. But you were given that chance. You were given that chance to make fans believe in you. Terry Funk, I believe, once famously said, "These people out here might think this stuff is fake, but I'm going to make them believe that I'm real."
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and I think Ric Flair did that, right? Like he lived it outside of the ring. And I think that we're starting to see in WWE maybe a move back in that direction, which I think is a positive thing. And I think it partially accounts for their increased attendance and just the overall interest in the product. And so I think that's going to continue, and I think they're going to continue to see successes as long as they do that, as long as they are more responsive to fans. And like Matthew said, the incident with The Rock, right? There was a backlash against that when it appeared that he was going to face Roman Reigns and Cody was going to be left out. And they course corrected very quickly in response to that negative reaction. And then rolled with it, turned the Rock heel, and it's worked out great so far. So I think I hope that we continue to see wrestling promotions looking at how fans respond and adjusting accordingly in their storytelling, because I think that will help restore some of that passion and that sense of investment in what happens with the fans.
Just to wrap it up, one thing I think is going to be interesting is now that AEW threw open the forbidden door and now we see WWE doing it more, I'm curious to see in 5 years if we're going to have a shared wrestling universe, kind of like how it was during the territorial system. But at that time, of course, you didn't have the ability to know what was going on in all the other territories like you do today. So I think that transmedia, shared wrestling universe, I'm just going to coin that now. I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops as the larger promotions work with the super indies who work with the indies, and kind of like a minor to major league baseball relationship as well.
Yeah.
So,
And internationally.
and international.
Yeah.
And even maybe before that, just watching, we're already kind of seeing a new transition with, Cody's gone back to WWE, Jade Cargill's gone to WWE. We have what might happen, just contract wise,
Sean
which is just going to
Spears.
be interesting. Yeah, just interesting to see that even kind of like as maybe leading towards something like that.
I would love if in like several years you actually have a joint show between AEW and WWE, and then throw in like New Japan, throw in AAA, CMLL, throw in. It would be fascinating to see if we had that type of relationship going on. Aaron?
Yeah, actually, a few months ago, the major Japanese promotions actually announced something to that effect, where they're going to essentially coordinate as an industry more closely with each other, which should, in theory, lead to more joint shows and cooperation. So you already see something like that in Japan, which of course doesn't operate on the same financial scale as WWE or AEW do, but certainly I think the possibilities there, and I can only imagine the political minefield you would have to negotiate, right? If you said, hey, let's have Roman Reigns face Samoa Joe, right? And they're both champions. There's a double DQ. We can all like bet money on that, right? But like that used to happen. Ric Flair wrestled Bob Backlund when they were champions of their respective promotions. That used to happen, and you would have to come up with kind of a double count out type scenario, but still just getting them in the ring would be incredible. Yeah. And certainly, imagine the interest, right? Because you're somehow kind of getting both fan bases invested. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's more profitable though to have the quote unquote war, right? Like the Monday Night War again kind of thing. So
you could always
I don't
frame
know
it
if,
that.
right. But it's you also don't want to leave it like it's like when Vince and Eric Bischoff hugged, right? And effectively just ended the WCW WWFE thing. But it is all exciting. I've been saying for forever that they've been working together the entire time. So, you never know. The ultimate kayfabe.
Exactly. I think Kit Majeski once said that you know, everything is a work until it becomes a shoot. So I think everything is possible. They can always retcon anything so that becomes actually how it always was. And I think that's kind of where, even if we don't have the same wonder that we might have in the past, there's still you have no idea what's really going on. Even if you think you know, you can never truly know because you're not one of the ones on the inside. And that to me is what is so fascinating about professional wrestling. So we're at time, so I want to thank all of you for spending a little bit of your time today to talk all about this. And yeah, I hope you have a great Easter weekend, a Passover weekend, Ramadan, spring, end of the school year, whatever it is you want to be celebrating at this time. And if you're going to watch WrestleMania, have fun with WrestleMania, but also the week after WrestleMania, the Professional Wrestling Studies Association is running WrestlePosium 5, which is a free online symposium that brings together fans, scholars, and professionals in professional wrestling to talk smartly about professional wrestling. So I'll put the link in the description below, and we'd love to have everyone come and hang out and geek out with all of us. So have a good one, everyone.